Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy. David Hume, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 6.
We've been explaining how Aristotle originally understood the concept of causation, and how that original understanding reflected his physics and his understanding of motion. We also showed how philosophers for more than 2,000 years used Aristotle's understanding of causation to reason backwards from the effect to the cause. All of this is relevant to Hume's philosophy, precisely because Hume was the first philosopher who dared to challenge Aristotle's understanding of causation. If Hume is correct and Aristotle is wrong, then every major philosopher for over 2,000 years had argued incorrectly. What is Hume's understanding, and what was its source? Hume analyzes causation based upon Newton's physics, beginning with an assumption directly opposed to Aristotle's. Aristotle had argued that rest was the natural state, but now Newton argues that motion is the natural state. Consider Newton's first law.
A body in motion continues in motion in a straight line and at a constant velocity, so long as it is not impinged upon by another body.
If motion is the natural state, then our task is to explain a change of motion, a change in direction or speed. Newton's physics sees rest as arrested motion. If motion is the natural state of every object, what prevents the chair you sit on from moving? The floor keeps it at rest. Remove the floor and the chair will move, though I don't suggest you verify this with an experiment. How is change of motion explained in Newtonian physics? A body changes its motion when it collides with another body. One can think of the Newtonian universe as a billiard table. The motion of one ball is communicated to a second ball, which moves more quickly or more slowly or in a different direction. Motion from the second body then explains a change of motion of the first body. The second body changes the motion of the first body and is called an efficient cause. Hume uses this billiard table analogy to explain causation in his own words.
Here is a billiard ball lying on the table, and another ball moving towards it with rapidity. They strike, and the ball, which was formerly at rest, now acquires a motion. This is as perfect an instance of the relation of cause and effect as any which we know. Let us therefore examine it. It is evident that the two balls touched one another before the motion was communicated, and thus there was no interval between the shock and the motion. Contiguity in time and place is therefore a requisite circumstance to the operation of all causes. It is evident likewise that the motion which was the cause is prior to the motion which was the effect. Priority in time is therefore another requisite in every cause. Let us try any other balls of the same kind in a like situation, and we shall always find that the impulse of the one produces motion in the other. Here, therefore, is a third circumstance, a constant conjunction between the cause and effect.
In Newton's physics, there are only efficient causes, that is, initiators of motion. So today we just speak about cause in general rather than discussing 4 different categories of causes. If there's only one kind of cause, namely the efficient cause, then there are no formal or final causes. If there are no formal or final causes, then we can't logically infer the efficient cause from the formal cause, as Aristotle and later thinkers such as Descartes had maintained. Another way of saying the same thing is that we can't argue backwards from the effect to what the cause might be, sight unseen. Hume denies that there is a necessary connection between cause and effect, so he denies the traditional Aristotelian notion that the alleged formal, efficient, and final causes are connected to one another. He says that there's only one cause, the initiator of motion. Descartes argues in reverse that our concept of God could be caused only by God himself. But this simply won't work in the world of Newton's physics. Descartes' argument presupposes the traditional Aristotelian notion that we can make inferences in reverse, here again based on the idea that formal and efficient causes are identical for all physical motion. Although Hume might accept that there is an intelligent cause or principle of order to the universe, he says we can't argue backwards from what we see in the world, we can't say precisely what God or that cause must be. Hume agrees that we can sometimes argue from the effect to the cause, but the argument is acceptable only if we've experienced the sequence of cause and effect, what Hume calls constant conjunction. Most of us have seen footprints in the sand. If we walk on a beach and see footprints, we can legitimately infer that someone must have walked there before we did. Because of past experience, we might even be able to tell the person's weight by examining the size and depth of the footprint. But we couldn't infer the person's hair color. There's no past experience to show how hair color is related to the size of footprints. Hume makes a similar argument, again using the metaphor of the billiard balls.
Were a man such as Adam, created in the full vigor of understanding, without experience, he would never be able to infer motion in the second ball from the motion and impulse of the first. It is not anything that reason sees in the cause which makes us infer the effect. The mind can always conceive any effect to follow from any cause, and indeed any event to follow upon another. Whatever we conceive is possible. It would have been necessary for Adam to have had experience of the effect which followed upon the impulse of these two balls. He must have seen in several instances that when the one ball struck upon the other, the second always acquired motion. If he had seen a sufficient number of instances of this kind, whenever he saw the one ball moving towards the other, he would always conclude that the second would acquire motion.
Hume says we can imagine all sorts of causes, but only experience can tell us what to believe. Using Newton's insights, Hume tells us that causation consists only of efficient causes, and these causes are prior to, contiguous to, and constantly conjoined to their effect. When Hume presented his view of causation to the philosophical community, he was met with indifference, misunderstanding, even scorn. Some accused him of denying that causation exists, but there was no denying that Hume's analysis of causation embarrassed those living philosophers who'd worked in the Aristotelian tradition. Many of these thinkers had tried to prove the existence of God by using Aristotle's view of causation. Now, in the age of Newton, this was no longer legitimate. Having undermined these proofs for God's existence, Hume also was accused of denying that God exists. But we've already seen that Hume, quite to the contrary, affirmed the existence of God. What Hume rejected were implausible proofs of God's existence. He rejected arguments that used the old Aristotelian conception of causation. Typical of Hume's critics is the Reverend John Leland.
Mr. Hume is an ingenious writer who hath lately appeared against the Christian cause. Hume has carried scepticism to an unreasonable height, which strikes at the foundation of natural as well as the proofs and evidences of revealed religion. Hume's works manifestly tend to subvert the very foundations of natural religion. Another part of them is particularly leveled against the proofs and evidences of the Christian revelation. The connection between cause and effect in this case is not merely in our thoughts, as this gentleman is pleased to represent it, but this very connection in our thoughts is founded on a connection which we perceive in the things themselves.
Aristotle's analysis of causation was used famously during the 17th century by the highly influential English philosopher John Locke. In response to scientific discoveries, Locke had maintained that we do not see physical objects directly. Rather, what we perceive are ideas or experiences caused in the mind by physical objects. Such experiences, or ideas, as Locke called them, could be divided into two categories. First, primary qualities, such as size and shape, are mathematically measurable and therefore considered to be real properties of the physical object itself. Secondary qualities, like color, are not objectively in the external physical object. They reflect how that object appears to a human nervous system. Locke had said the primary quality is caused by the object, and the secondary quality is caused by our own minds. Locke's argument was refined by a subsequent British philosopher, Bishop George Berkeley. Among other things, Berkeley pointed out that since we never see anything but the idea or experience, we have no reason to believe that there are any external physical objects at all. Berkeley contended that it would be much more consistent to argue that all ideas, whether primary or secondary, exist only in the mind. Hence, ideas are caused by minds, not by physical objects. Since human beings can control or cause only some of their ideas, there must be another mind that controls or causes the remaining ideas. That other mind, claimed Bishop Berkeley, was God himself.
The table I write on, I say exists. That is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning thereby that if I was in my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit or mind actually does perceive it. There was an odor, that is, it was smelt. There was a sound, that is, it was heard. A color or figure, and it was perceived by sight or touch. This is all that I can understand by these and the like expressions. For as to what is said of the absolute existence of physical things without any relation to their being perceived, that is to me perfectly unintelligible. Their existence is in their being perceived, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them.
David Hume appreciated the force of Berkeley's argument. He especially admired Berkeley's point that we can never experience objects themselves, as Locke had suggested. This means that there's no way we can check, independently of our ideas or experiences, what is causing those objects to exist. But Hume didn't agree with the rest of Berkeley's argument. As he put it,
"It is in vain to inquire whether there be body or not. That is a point we must take for granted in all our reasonings."
Hume doesn't reject the conclusion that there are external physical objects any more than he rejects the belief in God. He simply wants to reject Locke's argument that we can always trace backwards from the effect to the cause, from our experience to the physical objects. Hume says that to do this, we must have prior, constant, conjunctive experience of how objects cause experiences. Once more, Hume's unusual understanding of causation, based on Newtonian physics, undermines an important argument in the work of previous philosophers. Inevitably, Hume began to sound to his contemporaries like a negative thinker who delighted in undermining the arguments of others. On the contrary, Hume was steadfastly committed to accepting common sense. What he rejected were bad philosophical arguments that tried to justify common sense. According to Hume, common sense, tradition, and habit are what justify everything else. They do not need justification. One of the sources of Hume's image as a negative thinker was the author James Beattie. Beattie's book, An Essay on the Nature and Immutability of Truth in Opposition to Sophistry and Skepticism, went through 5 editions between 1770 and 1776, the year of Hume's death. Beattie's attacks on Hume were quite personal.
Hume's works are unnatural productions, the vile effusion of a hard and stupid heart that mistakes its own restlessness for the activity of genius, and its own captiousness for sagacity of understanding.
Beattie's attacks on Hume were successful and popular. The famous British painter Sir Joshua Reynolds even created a painting entitled The Triumph of Truth to symbolize Beattie's popular victory over Hume. In that painting, Beattie is depicted in his academic gown holding a copy of his book, The Essay on Truth. An angel representing truth is shown pushing David Hume and Voltaire into a bottomless pit. Beattie saw himself as a follower of the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, who succeeded Adam Smith as professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. Reid founded the Scottish Common Sense School of Philosophy. He and Beattie saw themselves as defenders of common sense against skepticism. Hume was so incensed by Beattie's personal attacks that in 1775 he appended an advertisement to all future editions of his book, The Inquiries.
Most of the principles and reasonings contained in this volume were published in a work of 3 volumes called A Treatise of Human Nature, a work which I projected before I left college, and which I wrote and published not long after. But not finding it successful, I was sensible of my error in going to the press too early, and I cast the whole anew in the following pieces. Yet several writers, namely Thomas Reid and James Beattie, who have honoured my philosophy with answers, have taken care to direct all their batteries against that earlier juvenile work, which I published anonymously, and have affected to triumph in any advantages which they imagined they had obtained over it, a practice very contrary to all rules of candour and fair dealing, and a strong instance of those polemical artifices which a bigoted zeal thinks itself authorized to employ. Henceforth, I desire that the following inquiries may alone be regarded as containing my philosophical sentiments and principles.
In a follow-up letter to his publisher, Hume stated,
This advertisement is a complete answer to Dr. Reid and to that bigoted, silly fellow Beattie.
Some years later, the great German philosopher Kant pointed out that Beattie had completely missed the point of Hume's philosophy.
Hume might fairly have laid as much claim to common sense as Beattie, and in addition to a critical reason such as Beattie did not possess.
As we've seen, Hume wasn't a mere negative thinker. To take yet another example related to the issue of causation, Aristotle had believed that an object can be understood in isolation from other objects. This perspective enables us to examine an effect alone and infer what its cause must be, without any prior experience of the cause. We can call this a belief in an isolation test. But Hume says we can't isolate objects. To understand them, we must consider both their context and the influence of other objects. We can see this reasoning in Hume's political philosophy. Hume attacked the theory that people enter a tacit social contract in civilized society because this theory supposes that society was preceded by a state of nature. This state of nature, as described in the work of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, was supposed to tell us what the world was like before man lived in society. Hume argued strenuously that man's original state was social. No isolation test could reveal what human nature was like. Therefore, we should not ask, what is man like in isolation? We should ask, what are the things that most influence us in the world as we find it?
Our self, independent of the perception of every other object, is in reality nothing, for which reason we must turn our view to external objects, and it is natural for us to consider with most attention such as lie contiguous to us or resemble us.
This is the end of Part 6. Please download Part 7 to continue.